We're now joined by independent counter-terrorism and organised crime expert David Otto. David, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the programme. Is it a coincidence that these Malian troops come under fire literally days after the French said that they were withdrawing?
Yes, I mean, it depends on the perspective that you're looking from, Peter. I think, from the Malian side, they would see this much more as a coincidence. This is something which occurred in a Malian-led operation. Therefore, this was perhaps a planned operation by the Malian government itself. So, they would see this much more as a coincidence. But from observers who have actually, complained about the exit of France, I think from the French side, they would want to see this as a gap, that has been exploited by the so-called jihadist groups. But you've got to remember that the Malian government has accused the French government of actually instigating, or in a direct term, sponsored terrorist groups, in some part of the country. So, this is much more from a Malian side, perhaps, some kind of a fight back, by these jihadist groups, just to demonstrate, perhaps, that, the French are required in the region. Of course, this is a narrative that would be in favor of a French-led operation. So I think, this is something which we have to really look at from various perspectives. But, it's a big coincidence for observers, again, because, of course, the Malian government has asked the French to leave immediately, within 48 hours, something which is very challenging to do from an operational perspective.
Where are the Russian contingents in all of this? Because Mali seems to be banking on help from Russia.
Yes, of course. I mean, the Malians have not been very clear in terms of where they have actually deployed the Russian contingent. They say that this is an internal security matter, but I'm guessing this would be in the region of Kidal, where the Malian, that's in the north of the country, where the Malians accused the French of actually exploiting the security situation to their advantage. I would guess also that would have some of the Russian forces in Timbuktu. Now, of course, where we have the French is in the region of Gao, which is the triangle of the Liptako-Goma between Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. But I doubt that, we will get much from the Mali regarding the Russian position, because, of course, we still have the French forces in Mali. They haven't pulled out. I mean, for me, it was kind of clear, Peter, that it would be very challenging for the French to continuously stay in Mali, because, of course, we had this conversation before. After 9 years of the Operation Barkhane, the implementation of the Operation Takuba, the presence of MINUSMA, which is the United Nations mission in Mali, and the G5 Sahel, all these multiple operations that have been launched, it was bound to fail. And the French have been at the head of this. I think it's time for, some kind of a review of, counterinsurgency partnership. Let's see how it goes.
But in the short term, it looks as if Mali's more vulnerable to jihadist attacks. And if they were struggling with French help, then without any help, surely this tips the balance in favor of the militants.
Yeah, you've got to understand the operational aspect of counterinsurgency. I mean, if you've been relying on a partner like France with the huge military presence, for the 9 past years, or for the past 9 years, whichever you like, then what you actually see is a huge gap being created. Remember, the Malians were not actually prepared to have the French vacate, in the manner in which we've seen in the recent weeks and months. So it will leave a gap, even if, the Malians are saying that this will be filled by the Russians. I mean, the French had about 5,000 forces. I mean, they had withdrawn some of them, about 2,000 of them, and placed them in the Gao region. But still a huge 3,000 personnel were still present in Mali. This is a huge number. I don't think, we have seen the same replacement being done by Russia. But of course, this is a counterinsurgency operation. It takes time to build relationship within communities. Russia will not be able to do that, in the speed of light. The French had done a lot of groundwork for the past years. So there will be a huge gap. And the Malians should have thought about this, and they must think about this and see how they can claw back some of the disadvantages of sending away a partner like France and bringing in another, who has to learn the terrain. They have to buy the trust of the people. So I don't have any doubt that you would see in the short term sporadic attacks being launched by jihadist groups, because of course, there is an opportunity to do so. But also because the new guys in town don't have the knowledge of the ground, the Russians. But I mean, Peter, it depends on what the Malians are planning to do. If they lead the operation in hand with the Russians, then it will be easier for the Russians to accommodate into that strategy. But one thing is clear, from a security perspective, I don't think, the Malians have made the right decision to bring in one foreign nation and, send back the other. I mean, it sends a very wrong message. What I would have expected, to see, and I'm sure perhaps you come back to that, is to see Malians leaning towards, African nations. I thought Nigeria would be one of them, but of course, the Malians have been suspended by ECOWAS. And inevitably, it means that most of the ECOWAS countries, like Nigeria, cannot directly help. But in the principle of sovereignty, I would have preferred to see bilateral agreements with countries like Nigeria, perhaps Rwanda, or other countries that have experience in counterinsurgency, rather than replacing France with Russia. I mean, but again, Peter, this is not my decision, it's not yours. This is purely a decision from Mali and Malians themselves.
I think you've preempted my next question a bit, because ECOWAS has imposed sanctions on this military junta. That then, I guess, further isolates them and perhaps makes it more difficult for them to get help. I mean, ECOWAS have troops that they've deployed. We've seen them in Gambia. And one would have thought that with France going, it would have been a natural thing to do is to look to your region first. And as you were suggesting, countries like Nigeria, but ECOWAS as a whole could have been that support. But with sanctions in place, that makes them even more vulnerable, I'm guessing.
I think what ECOWAS has got to understand, principally, is that if you leave Mali vulnerable, then you're leaving the entire Sahel, which is, hooked up with the Central Africa and the Lake Chad basin states, including Nigeria. I mean, these countries are all suffering from the spillover effect of terrorist groups. There must be, one focus in terms of the economic sanctions, which have been levied against Mali for reasons of the political or the military coup d'etat. But also, I think ECOWAS has to distinguish between the short-term impact of the economic sanction, but also the long-term impact of, leaving Mali vulnerable, isolated. That distinction has to be made. Now, what that means is that Mali is now exposed, in the hands of foreign nations, because of course ECOWAS cannot stop Mali from having bilateral agreements, even with countries like Nigeria or Rwanda or South Africa or any other country. What I see, I mean, and what I would, if I were asked to advise the Malian government or the ECOWAS, is to make a distinction. This is an African country. Yes, there has been double coup d'etats in Mali. Yes, the military has refused, the military junta has refused to hand over power, and they've promised a 5-year transitional period, which is not acceptable. But the bigger picture, in terms of the insecurity that this causes, the destabilization that this will cause in the Sahel region, with the pull out of France, this is something that has to be reconsidered, by ECOWAS, but also more so by the African Union. I would like to see African countries, championing this counterinsurgency in their backyard, helping each other, just like what South Africa is doing in Mozambique, what Rwanda is doing in Mozambique. This is what we want to see in the next 5 or 10 years to come. We don't want to see European countries that have no knowledge of the region, coming in to help when we have very powerful African countries that can do the same job. So I'm an Africanist, and I believe that, help can come from Europe in different ways. But when it comes to boots on the ground, when it comes to understanding the terrain, let us rely on our African brothers. This is what, we should do all the time.
I suppose one of the challenges is that, and we've seen it in Afghanistan, the Taliban suddenly became in charge and they weren't ready to be running governments. Soldiers are soldiers, and now suddenly they're holding political positions, and perhaps this is what's contributing to some of the decision making and why the ECOWAS wants a civilian government in place, because the soldiers probably don't have a full understanding of what it is to run a country with all of its facets, the economy and other things. Is this not contributing to some of the problems that Mali is facing and will face going forward if the junta stays in place until 2025 as they want to?
I think it has to be entirely up to Malians whether they continue to tolerate the military junta to be in power. I mean, at one point, they would have to go using the democratic principle of seeking for elections and presenting themselves or others as candidates. Now, what has happened in the case of Mali is very specific. The Malians had complained about the government of Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta. They said the economy was in chaos, the country was facing high insecurity, and they wanted, some change. But, of course, the change, came from the military. Why? Because, of course, these governments have made a history of relying on the military as the middleman to protect them, to keep them in power. And all of a sudden, the military finds itself in a position where, well, if we can keep these guys in power, why not rule it ourselves? So that's the first thing. But secondly, I don't see this being a replication of the situation in Afghanistan. We must remember that the Taliban was a government, before 9/11. They were a full-fledged state. They were removed from power preemptively by the United States and her allies, on the basis of the 9/11 attacks. And of course, they've come back to power. They cannot be compared to the likes of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb or Jenim or the ISIS movement in that region. They cannot be compared to that. Now, what I see in the future is a Malian state, which of course will suffer the consequences of going through this period of, whether the military should stay or the military junta should continue in power after these double coups. But I can tell you 100% that, this has to be a decision that Malians have to make. It cannot be made by anyone out of Mali. And what I see in future here is a country that, perhaps will have challenges in the beginning, because of all this chaos that is happening. But I hope to see some African help coming in. I hope to see African countries rallying around Mali and having these conversations. How can we step in? I mean, we've passed the time of, seeking help. I mean, I'm repeating myself, but I have to. We've passed the time of seeking help from European states when it comes to boots on ground. Let us do that using African nations. Let the European partners come as supporting nations, perhaps financially. Nobody's going to refuse that. But the time for boots on ground from European states is gone. Let's have our African states. They've got the capacity. They understand the ground. I mean, they speak the same language, perhaps. But, I mean, this is where I think, we should be going, Peter.
David, Otto, always great to get your insights on these issues. Thank you for joining us tonight.